Contradiction, on the intersections between being trans and gay. A quick disclaimer before I begin this talk. There will be sparing mentions of sex and very heavy mentions of transphobia. If either of these topics make you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to mute or leave the room for your own mental health. In addition, I would like to introduce or reintroduce some important LGBTQ+ vocabulary that I feel will be integral to understanding the experiences that I'm about to relay. We have transgender and cisgender, both adjectives, not nouns. Transgender describing an individual whose gender assigned at birth does not match the gender identity that they possess, and cisgender describing an individual whose gender assigned at birth does match the identity they now possess. Cisnormativity, noun, the assumption that cisgender identification is the norm, which effectively erases transgender experiences. And lastly, passing, verb, slang in the trans community for assimilating to a cisnormative culture, as mentioned previously, by changing one's gestures, mannerisms, voice, fashion, or appearance, or any combination of said characteristics. Lastly, I would like to dispel any misinformation or confusion that may reside around sexuality versus gender identity. While both are very important parts of one's identity, regardless if this person is cisgender, queer, heterosexual, or transgender, or any combination of the four labels, gender identity is one's internal sense or feeling of being affiliated to a particular gender, while sexuality is a label used to describe the gender or genders which an individual is sexually attracted to. Gender identity, in addition, has nothing to do with a person's anatomy or sex. I'm not trapped in my body, I'm trapped in other people's perceptions of my body. My body is something I can only love from afar, a mistress I can only caress in secret. It is death by way of choking. I have no air to even call for help. I first heard these words written and spoken by transgender and queer poet Ollie Schmincke before I knew what they meant, let alone knowing what they would one day mean to me. I came out as a transgender and gay male at 15 years old after 2 years of questioning my identity and contemplating my relationship with gender. I can unfortunately suffice it to say that my coming out was no rosy, movie-esque experience. Almost immediately after coming out, I was confronted with stressors and anxieties I had never experienced before. Peers who knew little to nothing about me would ask me what set of genitalia I had. Others would walk up to me and feel entitled to touch me, as if to conduct an experiment on an unknown specimen. I felt uncomfortably hypervisible, and I grew afraid that it was only a matter of time until each individual I met put the ideological disconnect between my identity and their idea of masculinity into a cruel comment that I would have no choice but to swallow. Now feeling exposed to a cisgender public, I was overcome by distressing and unanswerable thoughts. Will anyone ever love me like this? Will anyone ever find me attractive? Am I worth loving in the first place? It can be debated where I felt so strongly influenced to turn against myself. Media I was presented with, both educational and entertaining, hardly ever represented any transgender men. Ironically, media algorithms would observe that I was a transgender person for my choices in content, and then would push transphobic content to the forefront of my account. Of course, this content never reflected transgender men in a desirable, let alone stomachable light. When envisioning romance between two men, including transgender men, was completely out of the question. Descending into scrutiny, I felt that my body, my identity, and my masculinity belonged to everyone but myself. My body has so often been the topic of discussion, and I'm here to reclaim the position of the speaker. Emerging into new labels for a better fitting identity meant shifting the way I thought about day-to-day life. Balancing the complicated concept of passing, I planned my outfits on whether or not I would be perceived as male from a cisgender perspective, putting absolutely no regard into whether or not I felt confident or comfortable in what I was actually wearing. I spoke less around people I didn't know in order to save myself from their sobering realizations that I was, in their eyes, a fake, cosplaying masculinity, if you will. In addition to these behaviors acquired from living with transphobia and normalized rigid interpretations of gender, I began living my life in numbers, specifically percentages. As a queer teenager relying on the internet for defining what I was experiencing, I came across a study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships by Karen Blair and Rhea Hoskin. In this study, nearly 1,000 cisgender individuals were asked if they were willing to date transgender individuals fitting within the constraints of different sexualities. It was found that 88.5% of the cisgender group marked gay men were unwilling to date transgender individuals whatsoever. Imagine being confronted with a study delineating how likely it is for someone to love you, how likely it is for you to be held, desired, wanted. I lived my life knowing that only 11.5% of gay men would even think about loving someone with a body or identity like mine, if that number. The dehumanization of transgender individuals into unnatural subhumans is both undoubtedly and unsurprisingly a key reason behind the exclusion of transgender people from the world of romantic relationships. In a study conducted by John Stewart from the College of William and Mary, skin conductance levels were measured of a cisgender sample in reaction to video and photographic stimuli involving transgender bodies. Skin conductance levels can measure emotional or psychological arousal of a participant by gauging the electricity on the surface of the skin. It was found that individuals with more extreme reactions of sexual disgust were reported endorsing anti-transgender policies, while individuals with lower reactions of sexual disgust in response to the stimuli were reported endorsing pro-transgender policies. These responses, Stewart argues, while biological, can be increased and decreased based on the influences of one's surroundings. But knowing this, what kind of society could knowingly and intentionally foster the dehumanization of an entire group of people? It is absolutely the environment we live within today. The dehumanization of transgender individuals exists in every facet of life. Fetishization can be defined as reducing and commodifying an aspect of one's identity into an object of sexual desire. Unlike the bullying or exclusion of transgender individuals, this form of dehumanization wears a facade, an appealing facade of genuine romantic or sexual interest. After being deprived of love and then convinced into a hopeless and depressing mentality, fetishization can deceptively look like one's first and only chance at escaping a reputation of repugnance. As opposed to name-calling, intimidation, or gatekeeping, however, fetishization instead boils down the sexuality of trans men into something to be consumed by a cisgender audience. Looking at the previous study conducted by Blair and Hoskin, an interesting pattern emerges within the cisgender individuals willing to date transgender individuals. 28% of the cisgender gay men were only willing to date trans women, even though their gender identities are typically considered incongruent with the definition of being gay. 69% of trans-inclusive cisgender lesbians were only willing to date trans men, regardless of the fact that a lesbian is typically defined as a woman, feminine person, or other iteration of gender that is attracted exclusively to other women and/or forms of femininity. Fetishization begins in an utter lack of respect for the seriousness and validity of one's identity in relation to the perception of their body. cisgender bodies do not always conform to societal standards of perceivable masculinity and femininity, it is not uncommon for others to view transness and trans bodies as exotic. This ideation of our identity is thinly veiled as appreciation, when in reality the rarity we are fetishized for comes not from who we are, but what others think we have. Trans men in gay spaces primarily populated by cisgender men can be perceived as unique commodities, as they possess anatomy disobeying cisnormative ideals of what it means to be gay, therefore becoming guilty pleasures against their own volition. Fetishization is born out of sexualization and objectification, not respect. And due to the nature of fetishization and its disregard for respect, when attempts to be fetishized are denied by transgender individuals, the reaction on behalf of cisgender individuals is one of outrage. If you boil down a complex human person into what is essentially a rare sex toy, respect for the person's opinions and boundaries isn't necessarily part of your thought process when interacting with said person. Once again, this lack of respect and understanding for the trans identity is bred from a lack of education and representation on what being transgender means. Through conscious and continuous education, cisgender individuals can achieve an understanding of the hypervisibility and invisibility that accompany being trans, and transgender individuals like myself will one day feel a little more hopeful about being loved. It is here in the intersection between being transgender and gay that I and others have carved a space to stand. In both the objectification and the sexualization, I lose my agency, my power to ignorance and willing exclusion. It is also here in the intersection between being transgender and gay that I realize that the suppression of trans voices by a cisgender majority takes infinite forms, especially within the LGBTQ+ community. If I can ask something of you, it is for you to educate yourself with, as you may have noticed, a strong emphasis on you. While attempts to be familiar with the transgender experience are appreciated, do not treat transgender individuals as your personal dictionaries for all things trans. Resources such as Cachette, the Human Rights Campaign, and the University of North Carolina Wilmington's LGBTQIA faculty staff resources all have glossaries of queer terminology, complete with educational definitions. If you don't know where to begin, start by researching different terms for sex, gender, and gender expression. Learn the differences between the three. You can continue your education by researching and seeking out perspectives from trans authors on their relationships with their bodies, gender dysphoria, and societal expectations. If you are a cisgender queer person, be vigilant and active against transphobia in queer spaces. Monitor your own language for descriptions that enforce cisnormative ideals of sexuality. Protect transgender individuals from hostile and possibly violent or dangerous environments by being intolerant of both overt and covert transphobia. It has never and will never be enough to find peace in not being the perpetrator. While I'm no author, yet, I am a transgender individual writing about my experiences inhabiting this body and all of the side eyes, expectations, and uncomfortable moments that come along with it. The following excerpt from a poem I had written in freshman year entitled Forgotten portrays this complex emotional amalgamation that I only myself begun to experience. I am confounded by the way you make me feel so violently invisible. I forget whether or not the surgeries I want are for me or for others, my lovers. I forget that I would want to forget all of myself a little less if everyone else hadn't already forgotten about me. I forget that no matter if my body was painted so thick and royal blue that I could no longer breathe, it would still be my body, and I learned no man could ever love that. Thank you.